at Capital City Christian Church in Jefferson City, Missouri. I'm Bobby Schaefer-Cutter, and I'm joined by Frank Geringer and Elijah Odell. We're part of the pastoral team here at Capital City. At Capital City, we're a church on mission to encounter Jesus, to become like Jesus, and to love like Jesus. And one of the ways that we're focused on encountering Jesus this year is through an initiative called 365 in the Word. As a church family, we're intentionally spending time with God each day in 2026 using the Daily Bible as our guide. In today's podcast, we're looking at the content covered in the Daily Bible from January 1st to January 8th. So let's jump in to a quick recap on what we read this week, Elijah.
This week, we covered a lot. I would say, so 21 chapters from January 1st to January 8th, the first week of this. We covered in just 1 week. The creation of the world, the fall of the creation of the world, Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, God's covenant with Noah, the sons of Noah, all the nations of the world, the Tower of Babel, the call of Abram, God's covenant with Abraham, Hagar and Ishmael, the whole idea of circumcision, not going to dive into that as much, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the birth of Abraham's son Isaac. So anything that you might have learned on a flannel graph, that was covered this week.
The flannel graph.
It's not an experience I had, but I hear a lot of people talk about it.
Yes.
So all of that was covered this week, some of the most famous Old Testament stories, and some of my favorite Old Testament stories. But I want to do one point of clarification. So in our reading this week, we were in Genesis 10 for part of it, 10 and 11. And in Genesis 10:4, it says the sons of Javan. And this might have been a section that we all kind of, our eyes glazed over because there's a whole lot of names. Mm-hmm. But there's the sons of Javan, Elisha, Tarshish, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And it says, from these, the maritime peoples spread out into their territories by their clans within their nations, each with its own language. Now, this might be confusing to some people because in the next chapter, we have the Tower of Babel where language originates. But in chapter 10, the chapter before chapter 11, it says that they each had their own language. So why would that be the case? It seems like a contradiction, but in fact, it is not. And this is why. Because Genesis is a book of history, absolutely, and every chapter, every verse is historically accurate. However, not all the time is every single detail in sequential order. So it's basically like saying the band broke up, NSYNC broke up in 1987, but you don't get to that part of the story until later. You're just kind of doing a little bit of foreshadowing.
Yeah.
So that's kind of just a point of clarification.
Broke up.
Right.
Once again, not something I experienced, but something I think has hurt a lot of people. But anyway, that's a point of clarification just about how the book of Genesis and lots of the Bible is written.
Yeah.
I want to do a quick little deep dive, though, a little word study on Nimrod. I don't know about you guys. Nimrod is a great insult, but it might not mean what we think it means. What would you say Nimrod means?
As an insult?
Yeah.
Like somebody that's dumb.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
A dummy.
A dummy.
A dummy. If someone has done something stupid, they're a Nimrod. Well, in fact, Nimrod is a proper name. Cush was the father of Nimrod. It says in Genesis 10:8-9, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, I've heard a lot of people say, we use Nimrod as an insult, but look at him. He was the first mighty warrior on the earth. Mm-hmm. Except that might not be a good thing. So the etymology and the meaning of Nimrod's name, they're kind of uncertain. Just a callback to a sermon we had this last Christmas season when we were talking about mighty God. Mighty in Hebrew is Gibor, which is kind of connected to Nimrod's name. And his name might convey more of like violent, tyrannical power rather than just being a really great hunter. Mm-hmm. And if this interpretation is correct, then this is kind of a cool link that the author uses, author being Moses, that the author uses to connect us from Nimrod and these names of people into the Tower of Babel, which is a much more aerial view of humanity and creation. Now, as far as Babel goes, this is Genesis 11:1-9. This is kind of a deeper dive. And I love languages. I love biblical languages. I love modern languages. I think they're awesome. But one thing we learn from the Tower of Babel is that language is both a gift and a limit to us, which I think is really interesting. I kind of think of it as something that has given us a lot of freedom, but in fact, it inhibited our freedom in its origin. The bottom line about language being a gift and a limit to us is that God confuses this language among his people, not to restrain their own ingenuity, but to restrain their human arrogance. while still advancing his purposes. That's why he did it. The nations actually existed before Babel. This is not where diversity started. The nations existed before Babel. In chapter 10, we have something called the Table of Nations, which I always kind of thought of like United Nations, like everybody sitting around a big round table. Not the same kind of table. It's more like periodic table, like a table genealogy kind of thing. But the nations actually existed before Babel. Diversity was God's intention. It wasn't a punishment. But language was something that did disrupt this cultural arrogance. It disrupts a prideful unity, not a cultural plurality. Babel is actually a story about control and not curiosity. The tower is a story about the evils of centralized power, the evils of self-glorification in the hearts of humanity. It's not just architectural ambition. Because when I read it, I think, well, I just wanted to make a really great tower. They do say to make a name for ourselves, which is not great. I mean, that's obviously prideful. But there was a lot more to it than just we want to be seen from all around. It was kind of like, when we do this, we're going to be able to do anything. And the Lord said, we're not going to have any of that. That's why that's why it's called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. And that's where we get our idea of babbling and just babbling on and on and on. It's a Hebrew word meaning confused. And so he confused their speech. But it's kind of a tricky story when we're looking at it, because it sounds like God's limiting human progress, which we don't see very often in Scripture. Why would that be the case? But it's not progress, it's actually arrogance, and that's why he's limiting it in that moment. So those are some of the little exegetical, some of the deep dive notes that I have for this week. And I think we're going to move now to Bobby for a little, to Frank? Okay, excellent. We're going to move to Frank now.
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of application things from this first week's worth of reading. And I had to boil it down to one, which is really hard. But it kind of goes right off of what you just left off with Babel, this concept of arrogance. And this is just one of the thoughts that I kind of written down. In the Garinger home, we have a family motto. And we have different, we have family values, but we have a family motto. If you come to my house, if you're in our basement, it's on a plaque in our basement. But our family motto is simply this: you're not that big of a deal.
I love it.
You're not that big of a deal. Now,
I love it. Now,
there's a couple of teaching lessons here. The primary one is just to think through the lens of the humility that we all ought to have. And when we talk about it in our family unit, it's this concept of you think about it cosmologically, we're all insignificant. There have been millions and millions of people that lives have come and gone. They've done incredible things, right?
Like vapor.
Yeah, just a mist, right? Cosmologically, you're insignificant. Now we pair that with, but it's amazing that even though you're cosmologically insignificant, you're divinely loved by God. God knows you. God knows your name. God has a plan for you. All of that, but also this idea that listen, in the grand scheme of things, you're not that big of a deal. So it can be about something bigger than you, and that's kind of the lens in which we go at it with. And so one of the things that I was thinking about as we were reading, that obviously first week, we're getting into the very beginning of creation and all of that. And this was the thing that I thought about, that in our lives, we need to make sure that everything we do, we begin with God at the center and not ourselves. God at the center, not ourselves. And I find it so interesting that the narrative of Scripture, the Bible doesn't start with commandments. It doesn't start with advice. The Bible starts with God.
Yeah.
In the beginning, God, right? It's God, it's his power, it's his creativity, it's his intentionality. God comes first, and then humanity's role is secondary and responsive.
Yeah.
And so it just paints this beautiful picture of my goodness, if your life can begin and always have God at the center, not yourself at the center, it changes everything. And that's how the narrative of Scripture begins. And all of the issues that I ever get into in my life, the problems I get into in my life, they all go back to I'm trying to put myself at the center. And so that's just kind of, as I was reading it, just every time I think about that, the beginning of Scripture, it paints that picture, how we need to begin in our lives with everything, God at the center, not ourselves. So I think, practically, what does that look like? I think every day we need to start every day acknowledging God as creator, not consultant, right? God, we see his creative power in the very beginning. What if I acknowledge that every day? Like, this is God's universe, right? This is, that this is not about me, right? I'm not that big of a deal. My job is to make God a big deal. And then, asking yourself questions periodically, like, where am I acting like my life depends on me instead of on God? Practice beginning prayer or work by naming who God is before naming what I need. That's why, even when Jesus taught his disciples to pray, it's our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, right? It's starting from a place of worship, And so all of that, I think, kind of boils down to this kind of last, just thought is I think all spiritual maturity begins not with self-improvement, but with God awareness. And that's what Genesis opens with. It's this awareness of this big God outside of time, outside of space, who is in control, who is creator. And when we can make sure that our lives, when we recognize I'm not that big of a deal, my life is about making God a big deal. We begin with God at the center, not myself. And when my life is centered around this God awareness, that's when kind of real growth and maturity can happen. So that's kind of one of the things that I kind of really took away from it, and hopefully that's helpful to somebody.
I think it's so cool because it confronts the priority of our culture, which is ourselves. I think you can go into any TJ Maxx or Marshalls. No hate to them, but you can go to any TJ Maxx or Marshalls and see a mug or like a pillow that says like I'm kind of a big deal. I mean, that's like an expression. People want that on their hoodies and stuff, and it's definitely said in jest. It's a joke, but in every joke there's a little bit of truth, and people do kind of think that they're a big deal. I definitely have fallen into that all the time. Pride is a huge issue. Arrogance is a huge issue, and from the very beginning, it has been.
And you see that in this. First week's reading. And everything that goes wrong, all the ailments of humanity come from putting myself at the center. And whether that be individually or corporately, that's the way that it works and it flows. But I just think that again, Scripture, Bible, beginning with this God awareness, that's where we need to start in our lives each and every day as well.
I love that. And I love that it was God awareness because that's kind of where I was going with my thought as well. So they work well together. As I was kind of reading this week, I saw a really beautiful invitation to follow the example of God by engaging in a practice that helps shape our hearts and our minds. Actually, I saw several, as you guys said, but for the sake of time, I wanted to zero in on one in particular from the reading on January 3rd. So it's on page 15 if you're following along in your daily Bible and you want to look there. But it's a familiar story for a lot of people where they, like you said, flannel graphs, they learn way back in Sunday school or vacation Bible school about the story of Noah and about the creation of the rainbow. But I think that story, that example gives us a practice, teaches us a practice that can be really helpful to us as followers of Jesus today, kind of building that God awareness in our lives. So after the flood and after the year in the ark, year plus, Noah and his family leave the ark, and God makes that promise, covenant with them, that there's never going to be a flood like that. At the bottom of page 15 in our Bible, kind of from Genesis 9, it says, I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring the clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. And so as I was kind of thinking about that, God says that he's going to see the rainbow, and then he's going to remember his promise or his covenant. And we still, thousands of years later, get to see the rainbow and remember God's practice. And I think one of the invitations that we see from God is this practice of seeing and remembering, having visible reminders of God's faithfulness, of his mercy and his love. As I said, like thousands of years later, we still see the rainbow in the sky and get to remember that promise, but it's not just rainbows that's for. So something I want to invite you guys to consider as you're listening is, how can you create opportunities to practice seeing and remembering? It's something that God did. It's something that God invites us to do as we look at the rainbow. I had a mentor when I was a young mom and a young wife who encouraged me to put scripture verses all over my home. And so I have scripture verses just sat around throughout my home and my office. It's a way that I can see and remember who God is and what God has done in my life. It might sound a little silly, but I wanted to give you like one way that I do that. But I have a pressed clover that sits upstairs by my computer monitor in my office. And one day, several months back, I had been having just a few really challenging weeks, and I was feeling kind of discouraged, just feeling, I don't know, just discouraged is probably the best way to say it. But I went out from the office and went kind of for a little walk around our church campus and walked down to the prayer garden and sat and spent some time just praying. It's really peaceful down there. It's one of my favorite places to pray. But spent some time just sitting down there and praying and talking to the Lord about how I was feeling and sharing my heart with him and just asking him to remind me of his goodness and his love and his presence. And as I was walking back, I was just kind of looking at the ground as I was walking back, and I noticed all the clovers that are all over the grassy area out there. And as I looked down, I noticed all the clovers are little heart-shaped leaves. And it sounds so silly, but that was just like a sweet little reminder. And all of a sudden I was just like, I just felt the presence of God and his sweet reminder of his love. So I have that pressed. I pressed it in a book, and it's sitting upstairs on my computer monitor. And it's a way that I can look back and remember God's presence and his power. It's something that I felt like he spoke to me in that moment. So with the rainbow, God sees and remembers. There's little tangible ways that we can see and remember. So I'd like to invite you to just think of some practical ways that you can practice that. What are some ways that you can see and remember this week? Maybe see and remember God's promises, see and remember his power, and see and remember his presence and provision in your life. So that's kind of all we have for today. We're wrapping up. We want to invite you to join us in the next 7 days reading as we read a little bit more about Abraham and his growing family. So dive back into your daily Bible each day this week. And remember, if you have questions as you're reading, you can send us an email at nextsteps@capitalcitychristian.net and just put podcast in the subject line. We hope that you'll join us next week on the podcast and in service at Capital City Christian Church. See you soon.